These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. Last time, we looked at the remarkable survival of Babylonian culture, even as the circumstances of the city were in their most dire during the 9th and 10th centuries. But just as the indomitable human spirit causes all things to rise up, the oppressive weight of power politics causes all things to come crashing down. Politically, we've already covered how the Babylonian Dark Age is basically just a huge mess, but we do have enough lists and such that we think we can name some of the kings through this period, though most will readily admit that there are some totally unknown kings that fit in this period as well that we know nothing about. We brought our royal history up to 935 BCE last time we talked about Babylon, but that was 2 years ago now, so a quick refresher is in order. The Late Bronze Age saw Babylon dominated by the Kassite dynasty, which was the most enduring of Babylonian dynasties, but only the third most interesting, eclipsed by Hammurabi's Old Babylonian dynasty and the upcoming Chaldean dynasty of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Kassite period of stability, however, was critical in transforming the region that had once been the city-states of Sumer and Akkad into a unified area, indisputably led by the city of Babylon, including really integrating the semi-nomad and tribal ethnic groups of the countryside into the idea of being part of the Babylonian region. Perhaps most significant, occurring shortly before the end of the Bronze Age, the main channel of the Euphrates River shifted away from Kish and Nippur to flood much of the old city of Babylon. Now, archaeologically, this was a disaster, wiping away a lot of material that we might have otherwise recovered, and it's part of why we know so little about Kassite and pre-Kassite Babylon. But economically and religiously, it proved to be a godsend, or at least that's how the Babylonians seem to have interpreted it, as the great channel of the Euphrates River now flowed through the city that represented itself as the cultural center of the world. Marduk, patron god of Babylon, was ascendant, just in time for Babylon itself to begin a long descent. The Kassite dynasty was replaced by the Second Isin dynasty, which peaked with Nabu-Kudurri-Usur, which is Nebuchadnezzar I, and then succumbed to the Greater Darkness. It is with Nebuchadnezzar that the long rise of Marduk to a position of unique supremacy, traces of which had begun back in the Old Babylonian period, reaches its fullness, and this religious tradition will be maintained until the end of the Babylonian Empire. Right before 1000 BCE, a fellow named Simbar-Shippak appeared, some sort of military man with no particular lineage, though with an ethnically Kassite name. He either came from the east, conquered the region, then set up his power base down in the easily defendable swamps of the Sealand, or he originated in Sealand, took over Babylon, then led a series of extremely daring campaigns into the eastern mountains. Either way, he kept things stable for some 16 or 18 years, but then was probably assassinated. His assassin, Ea-Mukunzeri, was kind of a loser, and he got himself killed only 5 months later, and was replaced by Simbar-Shipak's son, Kashushu-Nadin-Ahi. He died shortly after without accomplishing much, but at least he wasn't assassinated. The nation had fallen into famine and chaos by this point, succumbing completely to climate shifts and Aramean raiders. Power passed after this to the Bazi dynasty, which is a group of eastern Kassites. The famine abated a bit under the Bazi dynasty, which gave these kings a bit more legitimacy, and 3 of them altogether ruled for a total of 20 years. And then they were beaten by a fellow called Marduk-Apla-Usur, who we're told is an Elamite, Though he's not one of those ruling Elam, he's just a military adventurer who happened to be of Iranian mountain descent. After this, we get into the native Babylonian kings, a sequence of often quite obscure rulers during a time so bleak and miserable that very little of note was accomplished. This sequence of kings is called the dynasty of but it isn't truly a dynasty in the sense of each king being related to each other. In this period, we often don't know the relationship between many of the kings. We just know that it often wasn't anything so clean as father to son for these centuries. Occasionally it was, but more often than not, it just wasn't. It begins in 978 BCE with Nabu-Mukin-Apli. He gained power over the land only in fits and starts, suggesting that though he was a native Babylonian, he built his power base outside the city, crowned himself in one of the other towns, possibly Borsippa, holy city of Nabu, then managed to unseat Marduk-Apla-Iddina, the Elamite, sometime around his second or maybe third year. Oddly, our best source for his reign is an extremely difficult to read fragment of a religious chronicle, which appears to detail a great stretch of this whole period, keeping track of which years certain omens appeared and which years the New Year's festival couldn't be celebrated. But despite the apparent length of this document, the sort of thing you would think would be very useful, basically only two small chunks of the entire thing are actually legible, and the only one whose kingship we can identify, and therefore the only chunk that we can actually date, is Nabu-Mukin-Apli. Now, within a few years, he was firmly ensconced in the city of Babylon, and he would rule for 36 apparently quite difficult years. Now, in one of these early years, there was an ill omen. You see, shortly after the New Year's festival, the city was so empty that a wolf was seen inside the bounds of the city, and some days later a deer wandered into the city without anyone seeing. Now, both of these animals were killed, but the presence of each is some sort of bad omen. Though we don't know the specific omen interpretation in terms of the ancient religions and such, it really says something that a once bustling city, which has large walls and only a few gates, can be so emptied out that a timid deer can make it into town. And it says how desolate the wilderness was that a wolf would try its luck inside the city walls. A similar incident happened in the 16th year, this time with a lion, suggesting that the wilderness famine was extensive, occurring either in both of these years or, honestly, more likely, just continuously, and then these two incidents happened at various times. In Nabu-Mukin-Apli's 7th year, the Arameans came to raid in such force that by the time of the New Year's festival, the king was unable to enter the city, either surrounded by or occupied by the Semitic raiders. We hear of something similar happening in the king's 19th year, and either Babylon or the region surrounding it remained so hostile that for 9 consecutive years following, it remained impossible to bring the gods Marduk or Nabu out for their New Year's possession. And I'm not being super careful with the chronology here, because we do get specific years for all of these events, but it really does seem like it's just a continuous sequence of famines and Aramean raids, and one year is much like the other, except for which specific places, which specific ways life is miserable. But then in the latter half of his reign, the king seems to have been plagued by bad omens beyond just the persistent famine and Aramean invasion. He had some sort of evil ghost or demon haunting his bedroom in his 25th year, and then in the following year, it seems he was shouted at by the god Adad via ill-omened thunder. In possibly his final year, he's said to have put down his weapons. At around the same time, we have a fragment of a record, one of the very few kuduru of this period, that tax collection in this period was extremely haphazard, and often whole years would go by with no written records, even within the same reign of who paid what. And so this kuduru, it was the 27th or 28th year, and in like the third year, they couldn't agree over what taxes has been paid, and so they came to an agreement, and they carved a giant stone so that they wouldn't forget, because record keeping was just so awful at this point. Now, despite these dire circumstances, the king of Babylon did reign over other cities in the region. Definitely at least the city of Isin, probably Borsippa as well. He did claim the title Shar-Kashati, King of the World, which was a bit of an exaggeration, but so it goes. His son, Ninurta-Kudurri-Usur II, succeeded on this same ill-omened throne around 944, and then he died in the same year. His next oldest brother, Ramush-Ili, was head official over the Babylonian temples, and it seems that he was so happy in his position as temple manager, or so unwilling to take over the challenging kingship, that he just decided, nah, I don't want to be king. And so the throne passed on to the third oldest son, Marduk-zakir-Iddina. Now, we know he was around for a while. He gets mentioned as being king of Babylon at some time during Ashur-dan's reign, which gives him at least 8 years on the throne, and we see him in a few mentions just as being king during the signing of various documents. Beyond that, though, we have no idea what he did or how long he reigned, and we don't even know who succeeded him. And this is the point at which most of our evidence for Babylon switches to the occasional Assyrian mentions that we've already seen up to this point in the show. Shamash-Mumadik is the next Babylonian king that we know of, though very likely he didn't directly succeed Marduk-zakir-Iddina, just because our main sources for Shamash-Mumadik come from all the way around 900 BCE, when he was fighting Adad-nirari II and largely coming off the worse for it. There's a good chance that he died either in one of these battles or shortly afterwards as a result of one of these battles. And then the relationship between him and the next king is unclear, but I would suggest that the next king, Nabu-Shuma-Ukin, was in fact wholly unrelated, as Nabu-Shuma-Ukin was actually probably a very remarkable figure, like the kind of person that you're just really impressed by. In the dark mists of history, Nabu-Shuma-Ukin managed to grab power in the national shame of his predecessor's defeat. He then managed to tame the tribes and towns most directly around Babylon and assert at least some level of control over a chunk of the Tigris and Euphrates. Now, some of this must surely have been military brilliance, the ability to organize a fighting force when no previous king had really managed it, and also to organize diplomatically a fractious bunch of semi-independent major cities and tribes of at least Kassites and Arameans. Therefore, he was a charismatic leader figure with a decent amount of military talent. He had, as the kids say, the Riz. Of course, he may also have been riding a rising tide of history. Back in our discussion of Ashur-dan, we asked how much of the Assyrian rise was due to things like the improving climate and the awakening of trade, and how much was due to the king's own competence. Here as well, we have to figure that the king must have been competent, otherwise one of the other local warlords would likely have overtaken him. But he is 3 decades behind the Assyrian rise, suggesting that the climactic shift was bringing Babylon along for the ride now, properly speaking. Still, we can't put all his success down to climate, as it was sometime around 892 that Nabu-Shuma-Ukin engaged with the aging Adad-nirari the second time, and managed to pull out a victory so solid and respectable that not only was he able to push the border much further north, back to something like the traditional border between north and south, but also secured a double royal marriage between the houses of Ashur and Babylon, and secured the reopening of north-south trade, and a firm alliance that would last 80 years, one of the longest periods of mutually respectful peaces between North and South in Mesopotamian history. The expansionist Assyria would push on these borders occasionally, but even though through all of these battles, the alliance between the two houses is said in various chronicles to have held fast. Now, how they can have an alliance while sometimes making inconclusive wars with each other, that's not totally clear, but such is the nature of piecing together ancient history. Nabu-Shuma-Ukin would be followed at some unclear year by his extremely successful and long-lived son, Nabu-Apla-Iddina. Nabu-Apla-Iddina is the high watermark of Babylon in this Dark Age, the spark which bore the faint promise of reigniting Babylonia into a prosperous kingdom to partner with or rival the ever-growing Assyrian Empire, sharing as it did the only border Assyria ever respected. Early in his reign, he showed a good deal of respect to Tukulti-Ninurta on one of his great camping expeditions, declining to register official complaint when the Assyrian army transgressed the Babylonian borders. The relentless expansion of Ashurnasirpal did see a few fortresses taken, but these are so minor that we don't even know where they were, and this whole taking of Babylonian fortresses may have just been something that Ashurnasirpal claimed purely for the propaganda value of being able to say that he conquered in all 4 cardinal directions. The psychopath king's abrasiveness did see the North-South alliance fray a bit, with Nabu-Apla-Iddina supporting the Suhu rebellion on the Middle Euphrates, but we know that this rebellion ended in tears for the fighters, and probably a summary defeat for the 3,000 Babylonian associated, though not officially Babylonian, soldiers sent to aid the rebellion. Still, though this ended in defeat for Babylon, things remained in good enough shape that Nabu-Apla-Iddina was able to conclude a treaty with Shalmaneser III when he took the throne in 858, and the two powers resumed their friendly relations. Assyria, at this point, was in awe of the cultural output of Babylon, which was back in full flower, having probably by now published the Epic of Era and Isham and recompiled a number of key omen and scientific texts. The commentary tradition is likely maturing at this point, as scholars in Babylon have enough safety and wealth to start again poring over texts which were at this point ancient even by their own standards, looking to unlock secrets long since forgotten. Babylon, for their part, shared the admiration of strength common to the entire Near East, and if their own military exploits were of, shall we say, variable success, they could admire the Assyrians, so as long as the two powers were at peace, and they were admiring their army oriented in directions very much away from Babylon. We have a single stone tablet from Sippar recording his achievements at any length, reading, Nabu-Apla-Iddina, king of Babylon, named by Marduk, beloved by An and Ea, who gladdens the heart of Sarpanitum, which is an increasingly common aspect or god related to Ishtar. The courageous man, well suited for kingship, wielder of an angry bow, who overthrew the wicked enemy, the Suteans, whose guilt was extremely great, and therefore into whose hands the Lord Marduk entrusted the scepter of justice and the shepherding of the people. His goals and accomplishments, it seems, were to avenge Akkad, to resettle the cult centers, to found shrines, to draw divine symbols, to restore rites and rituals, to establish regular food offerings to the gods, and to make more splendid meals for the gods. Now, we can't say for sure that he actually accomplished any of that, but given that he had perhaps 3 decades of mostly peace and at least some amount of military success, as the climate around him improved and trade volumes grew, it's quite likely that he was able to patronize at least some temples which had grown long neglected. For example, we have definite record of the temples in Sippar and Uruk having some degree of restoration in this period, and we see the reappearance of Kudaru stones along the new course of the Euphrates River after a good century of near total absence. When Nabu-Apla-Iddina claimed the title Shar-Kashati, King of the Universe, it would have been clearly in the shadow of the identical claims of the far more militarily successful Assyrian kings in the north, and yet it's more justified than anyone in the south who had made such a claim in well over 200 dark and bitter years. The traditional bounds of Babylonia, from the border of Assyria in the north and covering the basins of both great rivers at least to the sealand marshes, were properly under his control, with the previously unceasing raids at least managed to a certain extent, and possibly quieted down to a level of real peace. And then, having brought Babylon solidly out of its dark age and into a new flower of peace, prosperity, and cultural development, Nabu-Apla-Iddina passed away at an old age of natural causes, beloved by his people, respected by his neighbors, and well regarded by history. His son, as so often happens, turned out to be a schmuck. And this is where our story properly intersects the Assyrian narrative of Shalmaneser III. Marduk-zakir-shumi was the oldest son, while Marduk-bel-usati was the younger. For reasons unknown to us, both of these sons of Nabu-Apla-Iddina considered themselves to be the proper successor to the throne. Marduk-zakir-shumi, who I seem unable to stop mistyping and mispronouncing as Marduk-shakir-zumi, is our hero here, at least for a certain value of hero, and he takes the throne in Babylon itself, with control over the main central cities. Marduk-bel-usati, whose name I find to be quite memorable and easy to pronounce, has his power bases on the fringes, mostly along the Diyala River and around the Sealand. And those two regions, Diyala River and Sealand, strongly imply that he's getting his support not from the Akkadian city populations, but from the Kassites and the Chaldeans, making his rebellion a unique fusion of the old with the future. I'm not totally certain about this, but this might actually be the last time any Kassites are a major power player for the Babylonian throne, while it's also the first time we know of any Chaldeans pushing for the Babylonian throne, all at the nice, neat, round date of 850 BCE, being an easy-to-remember year for the end of one culture's dominance, the end, finally, of the Kassites, and the beginning of another, the Chaldeans. And of course, this comes right about the halfway point through the dynasty of Ur, which is both a low point in Babylonian power overall and the main period of time since Hammurabi's period where actual Babylonians were in charge of Babylon. But our friends Zakir-Shumi and Bel-Ushati were not interested in these larger scale historical shifts. They were interested in grabbing power for their personal advantage. And pretty quickly it became apparent that they had quite evenly split the military power of Babylonia between the two of them. Marduk-zakir-shumi, however, had an advantage in that he held control over the great temples of Babylonia and was therefore favored by the gods. And for all that this was, no doubt, a great spiritual advantage, it came with a strong practical benefit. Recall that we had previously been talking about the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III as an unusually pious man, and when Marduk-zakir-shumi sent a letter to his Assyrian counterpart requesting aid, he leaned on the strength of the now decades-old alliance between the two noble houses, as well as rightful patronage of the houses of the great gods of the south. And Shalmaneser, looking for an easy win after the difficult campaigns leading up to the Battle of Karkar, was persuaded to offer his assistance. Now Shalmaneser, for his part, seems thrilled to offer these campaigns to the glory of the shared gods of North and South. His earliest account of this campaign, which comes from shortly after its conclusion, makes no mention at all in this entire section of the god Ashur. Instead, Shalmaneser sees himself as a vigorous hero of the old southern tales, imbued with the spirit of Ninurta, god of action heroes. He comes to the North Babylonian city of Zeban, where he meets up with the Babylonian army of Marduk-zakir-shumi, and they both make pious and joyful offerings to the god Adad. And then they go to the Diyala region where they piously and joyfully slaughter the people of Me-Ternat. The plunder and destroy language here is pretty stereotyped. It's not clear to what extent the land was actually devastated, given that all Near Easterners were pretty harsh to rebellious people, but that the Babylonians are not known to have allowed the excesses of the Assyrians, and Shalmaneser accepts in his earliest inscriptions of the military campaign that this was something like an equal partnership between the two kings, not him just sweeping in and handling everything in his own way. In Shalmaneser's later records, he would sort of summarize this all as him sweeping in to save the Babylonian king and establish him on the throne, but it's really remarkable that in these earliest accounts, he's very scrupulous in noting that this was a joint campaign, at least in this first and second year. The twin armies, anyway, arrive at the Diyala Valley town of Gananante, where Marduk-Bel-Usate has assembled his force. Shalmaneser adorably calls Bel-Usate the king who did not know what he was doing, and sharply criticizes Bel-Usate's performance at the battle outside the wall, which was a sound victory for the alliance forces. However, having driven the enemy behind the city walls, they were unable to breach the fortifications and had to content themselves with a season of generally despoiling the countryside and holding tight on the siege. Shalmaneser ended up going back home, as did much of the Babylonian army, leaving the rebel force unbeaten. But next year, at the earliest possible moment, basically as soon as the New Year's festival was over in the springtime, Shalmaneser is ready again with the army and sets out from Nineveh, crossing river after river to approach Gananate from a different angle. Passing through the city of Lahiru, which did not enjoy its Assyrian attention, he came ready this time to properly breach the fortress walls. The rebel king escaped the pincer of the Assyrian and Babylonian armies closing in on Gananante, and the two kings gave chase to Mount Iasubu, after properly punishing the resistant city of Gananante. Then, heading up the mountain, the rebel Marduk-Bel-Usate's force was overwhelmed, and the rebel himself was captured and swiftly executed, along with his royal guard. But just because the war is now over, doesn't mean that Shalmaneser is quite finished yet. The Assyrian king turns at this point to the Babylonian king, and both seem elated at the success of their military alliance, with Shalmaneser asking only one thing of Marduk-zakir-shumi. Shalmaneser would like to worship at the great southern temples. You see, this is not something that he would have been able to just do in the course of normal events. Not only was he an extremely busy king, and so a vacation in Sumer and Akkad would probably not have fit into his schedule most of the time, but there was no way for him to simply enter the southern kingdom without some sort of excuse. He couldn't come as a conqueror because of the mutual respect and alliance between the two nations. And he couldn't come as a supplicant, begging the Babylonian king for a favor, as that would be beneath his kingly dignity. Only in the afterglow of this great mutual achievement, as part of a triumphal joint march to Babylon, would the king be able to achieve what he, in his record, calls his heart's desire, that being a tour of the great cult centers of the south. And so with both kings leading both armies, they paraded back down south. They stop at Kutha, city of Nergal, and worshipped that god in the aspect of divine hero, with Shalmaneser claiming in his dignified royal records that he bowed down at the temple gate and then made sacrifices and offerings. Then, again, in the official royal record of this journey, recorded for all of history in order to glorify the king and his nation, Shalmaneser's inscription reads, "He," that's Shalmaneser, "entered Babylon, link between heaven and underworld, the abode of life, and to Esagil, the place of the gods, abode of the king of all." Now, to be fair, I can only dream of ascending the great ziggurat in the heart of Babylon, looking out over the only recently restored city from the highest point on the horizon, the man-made mountain temple of Esagil. But this is also a level of official reverence given to no other non-Assyrian place or thing in, as far as I know, all of the Assyrian royal archives. Babylon was unique in the ancient Near East, and as a fan of both Babylonian culture and Babylonian gods, Shalmaneser is truly overawed by what he's seeing. This tells us about Shalmaneser, and it also reinforces what we saw last episode about Babylon really being a special place. Anyway, the king then continued his pilgrimage south to the city of Borsippa to visit the temple of Nabu. Now, Nabu worship is becoming something of a bigger deal in Assyria in general, and Nabu will continue to grow in importance through the empire. Some of this is the vagaries of fashion and faith, but it also seems that Nabu and Marduk are the two gods most closely associated with Babylon, and so they are the gods that Babylophiles in Assyria want to associate themselves with. Marduk, however, is a rather supremacist god, associated with the glory and kingship of Babylon, while Nabu, while still Babylonian and increasingly important within Babylon, is ultimately from Borsippa, and therefore less supremacist and politically much safer. After all, there are clear political implications to the assertions that are often made about Ashur or Marduk being king of the gods. Whether this dynamic has really taken hold of the religious landscape at this early date, That's debated, but certainly by the 700s, a century from now or so, it's going to be visible in both Babylonian and Assyrian religion, and there are some who suggest that it's already a feature at this point. In Borsippa, then, following the last of Shalmaneser's great offerings to the southern gods, Marduk-zakir-shumi and he threw a massive feast, to which both the good people of Babylon and nearby Borsippa were invited. Now, which king was officially hosting this feast is actually unclear, as the language doesn't make it super obvious, but it seems like a grand time was had by all. But somewhere amidst the feasting, perhaps during the speech-making and perhaps in a quiet moment afterwards, Marduk-zakir-shumi turned to Shalmaneser and confessed that Babylon and its glorious temples, while free of the threat of the king's rebellious brother, remained threatened by a new force. They had lent support to the rebellion, but stood unbowed in their sealand fortresses. And these were the Chaldeans, and they have enough strength to have basically taken over control of the entire swamp from Babylonian control and asserting themselves against central authority. Specifically, it's the tribes of Yakin, Dakaru, and Amukanu, and these are going to be the most significant Chaldean tribes, mentioned time and time again in records for quite some time to come. That means they'll be on the test: Yakin, Dakaru, and Amukanu. Keep them in mind for later. Shalmaneser, taken by sympathy for his brother king, and of course always happy to show off Assyrian military might, took the army further down south. While Babylon was unable to dislodge the Chaldeans, the much larger and more professional Assyrian army was able to march to the main fortress of each Chaldean tribe, push right through the relatively weak defenses, and capture massive plunder. And here I mean serious plunder. He records taking ivory, silver, gold, tin, elephant hides, and fancy wood, among more pedestrian sorts of plunder. The fact that these sorts of wealthy things were present down at the mouth of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers tells us that the grand international trade network, possibly including distant India, Central Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean Sea, is once again well and properly connected. It isn't the same network that we saw in the Late Bronze Age. For one thing, the involvement of the political elites seems much reduced in favor of the mercantile elites, but it still tells us that things are finally starting to look up for the Near East as a whole. And as Shalmaneser went home with his Chaldean plunder, Marduk-zakir-shumi sat quite contented in his palace. Surely he had shown that Babylon was the greatest city in the whole world, and he the greatest king. He had the favor of Marduk through military victory. He had overawed the powerful master of Assyria. His city was a center of wealth and learning unseen in living memory, and all his enemies at every border were quieted. Marduk-zakir-shumi, like all his predecessors, called himself king of the universe. But in the years after 850, there's a good chance that he was the first in a very, very long time who deep in his heart truly meant it. And for the next 25 years, as the new king grew old, things were about as good as they could be for Babylon, protected by Assyria and free to engage in their cultural and mercantile pursuits. We hear during this time that the peculiar political exemptions of the great cities were still being respected, and that because of these political privileges and the wealth of the state, that all thought of rebellion is, according to one of Marduk-zakir-shumi's inscriptions, long since forgotten in the land of Sumer and Akkad. Near the end of Marduk-zakir-shumi's life, however, and at the end of Shalmaneser's life, disorder and rebellion broke out up in Assyria. Now, we'll cover this rebellion in as much detail as possible, probably next episode, but the significance to Babylon is that Shalmaneser died in 824 to be succeeded by his son, Shamshi-Adad V. However, Shalmaneser actually had an older son named Ashur-danin-apli, who was part of the rebellion which had been ongoing for 3 years now, and the newly crowned Shamshi-Adad called upon his father's old friend, Marduk-zakir-shumi, to come to his aid. And come to Assyria's aid he surely did, playing a key role in putting down the rebellion. But unlike Shalmaneser, who couldn't stop gaping in awe over the glories of the Babylonian gods, Marduk-zakir-shumi was singularly ungracious in his victory. And I don't mean just slightly rude here either. It seems that once the victory had been won, the Assyrian army was critically weakened, while the Babylonian army still had much of its strength. The Babylonian king looked at his Assyrian counterpart and said that, since Babylon has just saved Assyria, I really think that the Assyrian king should get on his knees and grovel to me and admit that Babylon is the better country in perpetuity and become very close to a vassal. And that seems to be what happened. The Shamshi-Adad is in this treaty not permitted royal titles when speaking to Marduk-zakir-shumi. Shamshi-Adad is given a number of duties, such as information gathering and surrendering fugitives to Babylon. And Shamshi-Adad was expected to make regular reports, not even to the king of Babylon, but to some just subordinate of the king, some guy named Marduk-Ramani, to emphasize that the Assyrian leader is just some minor subordinate in the eyes of Babylon, not really worth the Babylonian king's time. Marduk-zakir-shumi, meanwhile, was probably cackling great evil laughs of villainous hubris. He alone was king of the universe, and none would ever have the power to challenge him. And as it turns out, he was exactly right. There was a later calendar tradition that even survived into the Islamic period, which dated Babylonian years from sometime around 822 BCE, counting from the date when the Arameans were finally and lastly defeated in the land, marking the absolute high watermark of Babylonian military security in this Dark Age. Surrounded by wealth, absolute in power, and of universally recognized glory, the greatest Babylonian king in centuries passed away peacefully of old age, succeeded by his loving and loyal son, Marduk-Apla-Iddina. Now there are a few minor things, to note about Marduk-Apla-Iddina, such as the fact that he was quite old when he took the throne, at least 45 and possibly a fair bit older. Also, from his reign, we have evidence that a number of high bureaucratic and advisory offices seem to have become hereditary, something that likely started before his reign but is confirmed here through various witness lists. He was primarily a builder who founded or expanded a number of temples and structures in the northern regions of Babylonia. And then, in 814, he suffered an absolutely massive Assyrian invasion. Shamshi-Adad had been miserable and furious, laboring each day under the insult that Marduk-zakir-shumi had inflicted both upon him personally and the dignity of Assyria as a whole. As we will see in upcoming episodes, however, Shamshi-Adad had been a bit busy for quite a while. In 814, however, he had some spare time. And what do Assyrian kings do when they have spare time? Why, they assemble the entire Assyrian army and march for sweet, sweet vengeance. The initial campaign was unstoppable, with the Babylonians apparently not even trying to stop the devastation. The Babylonian king was forced to cobble together literally everyone in the region, friend and foe, to stop the bloodlusted Assyrians from annihilating the entire south and salting the earth. And near the city of Dur-Papsukal in the northeast, the two armies absolutely pummeled each other, stalling the Assyrians in their tracks for the year at massive cost in southern lives. The next year, the furious Shamshi-Adad returned undiminished. This campaign went much quicker, having depleted the manpower of the southern peoples of the previous year. Marduk-zakir-shumi was attacked, put to flight, and captured. We don't know what happened to him during his captivity, but it's hard to imagine that the experience was pleasant. And as far as we know, he ended his life in the dungeons of Kalhu. Meanwhile, down in Babylon, they now had no king, and no one surviving in the royal line, and so a certain high official named Nabu-Apla-Iddina decided to try and, pick up the pieces, declaring himself king of Babylon in 812. Shamshi-Adad, still wholly engulfed by rage, likely screamed something like, "There will be no king in Babylon," and he marched his army back south for a third time. Nabu-Apla-Iddina was personally destroyed, as was his army, as was the town he was currently in, as was every city anywhere near his final resting place. Fortunately, by the time Shamshi-Adad got to Babylon itself, his rage had cooled enough for him to not completely devastate the most glorious city in all of civilization. And yet he made it very, very clear that the kingdom of Babylon was over, now and forever, and there would never, ever be any king here ever again. And so, for the next 40 years, give or take a bit, the entire Southland was a mess of total anarchy. It will emerge from this in half a century or so, with a set of Chaldean dynasties taking over, and will soon after come under near total Assyrian domination for a period of time. But for the most part, until Nabopolassar shows up some 200 years after this, Babylon is just going to remain mired in a dimly understood mix of anarchy and foreign domination. The glory that was Babylon will never be forgotten, and this brief flicker of hope in the 4-century-long Dark Age of the city will shine all the more brightly in people's memories. But Babylon, as a great force for pretty much anything, well, the last embers of that have been well and truly smothered. Next time we will not be looking at Urartu, as was previously anticipated. I keep pushing back my Urartu series because I keep finding more and more to read on the topic, but also because I keep seeing that the main action of Urartian history is always a bit later than I seem to realize. So instead we're going to look at the latter half of Shalmaneser's life, which will take exactly as long as it needs to. So join us next time for military campaigns, rebellious advisors, and most excitingly of all, a theoretical discussion of the relevance of central authority in ancient states. Thank you for listening.